The unexpected invitation life at Marcel's cafe was always the same for Olivia, a waitress in her mid-30s who had grown accustomed to the ebb and flow of daily routine. The clattering of cutlery, the muffled conversations of regulars, and the occasional excitement of new customers were constants in her otherwise monotonous work life. Olivia had been at Marcel's for almost 10 years, and while the job paid the bills and kept her and her son afloat, it offered little in terms of excitement or change. The cafe sat at the corner of a bustling city square, attracting a mix of office workers, tourists, and the occasional elite figure. But despite serving all walks of life, Olivia felt largely invisible. That all changed one rainy afternoon. David Wellington, a regular at Marcel's for years, was a man shrouded in mystery. Rumors about his fortunes circled like whispers, often caught between sips of cappuccinos and bites of croissants. Some said he was a tech mogul. Others believed he inherited a vast fortune from old money, and a few insisted he was involved in the art world. No one knew for certain, and David never offered any information to correct or confirm the rumors. To Olivia, David was just another customer. He was polite but distant, always impeccably dressed in tailored suits that suggested his wealth, but never flaunted it. He never demanded attention and always tipped well, but his interactions were brief, usually limited to an order of black coffee and a sandwich, which he would take at his usual table near the window. Olivia served him almost every time, and they had exchanged pleasantries but little more, until that day. The sky had opened up that afternoon, and the heavy rain pelted against the cafe's windows, casting a gloomy atmosphere over the usually lively space. Olivia wiped down the counter, lost in thought about her son, Ethan, and his school projects when she noticed David waving her over. This was unusual. He never waved for attention, preferring to sit in silence until someone naturally came to him. She approached his table cautiously, wondering if something was wrong. "Is everything all right, Mr. Wellington?" she asked with her usual professional smile, though she couldn't help but feel a slight nervousness creep into her voice. David looked up from his newspaper, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "Everything is fine, Olivia," he said smoothly, folding the paper and setting it aside. There was a brief pause, as if he was contemplating how to word his next sentence. "I wanted to ask you something." Her curiosity was piqued, though she hid it behind her practiced calm demeanor. "Of course, what can I help you with?" David leaned back in his chair, his expression soft but serious. "My birthday is coming up, and I'm having a rather extravagant celebration this year." He paused again, this time studying her reaction. Olivia blinked, confused. It was hard to imagine a man like David Wellington asking someone like her for advice on party planning. "I see," she replied, unsure of where this was going. "I would like you and your son to attend," David said simply, his words hanging in the air like a strange melody that didn't quite fit the tune of her life. For a moment, Olivia thought she misheard him. "Excuse me?" she asked, not to be rude, but to clarify what she thought couldn't possibly be true. David smiled, a small, almost imperceptible lift of the corners of his mouth. "I'd like to invite you and Ethan to my birthday party. It's going to be quite the event, and I think you both would enjoy it." Olivia felt her heart skip a beat, her mind racing to catch up with what he had just said. Why on earth would a man of David Wellington's stature invite her, a simple waitress, and her 11-year-old son, to what was surely going to be a lavish affair? It didn't make any sense. She didn't belong in his world, and neither did Ethan. Her first instinct was to politely decline. She opened her mouth to do so, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she asked, "Are you sure?" David chuckled lightly, sensing her bewilderment. "I wouldn't ask if I wasn't sure. You've served me here for years, Olivia. I'd like to think we've established a rapport of sorts, even if it's just through our small interactions." She nodded slowly, still in disbelief. "I'm flattered really, but why us? Why invite us?" David's smile widened, and there was a glint of something, maybe amusement, maybe sincerity, in his eyes. "Let's just say I have a feeling that you and your son might benefit from a change of scenery. Plus, I imagine Ethan could use a bit of excitement now." Olivia's thoughts immediately turned to her son. Ethan was a bright, curious boy, but he had always felt the weight of their modest life. They didn't have much, and Olivia did her best to give him a good upbringing, but there were limits to what she could provide. A fancy party in a mansion or wherever this event was being held would definitely be a new experience for him. But would it be a good one? I don't know, she said hesitantly. It seems like we wouldn't really fit in. David waved his hand dismissively, as if to brush away her concerns. Don't worry about that. You'll fit in just fine. It's not as formal as you might think. Besides, sometimes stepping outside of your comfort zone leads to the most interesting experiences. Olivia couldn't help but smile at that. His words resonated with something deep within her, a longing for change, for something more than the routine life she had settled into. Maybe he was right. Maybe this was an opportunity for both her and Ethan to see a different side of life, even if just for one night. Still, the invitation seemed surreal. When is the party? She asked, her voice softer now, as if the decision was slowly forming in her mind. Next Saturday evening, David replied, his tone casual but with an underlying anticipation. It's going to be held at my estate just outside the city. I'll have a car sent to pick you both up if you decide to come. A car. An estate. This was all too much for her to process. Olivia bit her lip, unsure of what to say next. David, sensing her hesitation, stood up and placed a crisp, cream-colored envelope on the table in front of her. Here's the formal invitation. Take your time to think it over. There's no pressure, but I do hope you'll consider it. With that, he gave her a nod, paid for his coffee, and left the cafe, leaving Olivia standing there with the envelope in hand, feeling as if the world had just shifted beneath her feet. She looked down at the envelope, her name written in elegant script across the front. It felt heavy not just in weight, but in significance. This was more than just a party invitation. It was an invitation into a world she had only ever observed from the outside, a world of wealth and privilege that she had never imagined being a part of, even for one night. As she stood there, lost in thought, the rain continued to pour outside, blurring the cityscape beyond the window. Olivia knew she had a decision to make, one that could change everything, even if just for a moment. The surprise of the invitation as the rain fell relentlessly against the cafe windows. Olivia remained standing near the counter, her fingers tracing the edges of the cream-colored envelope as if she expected it to vanish at any moment. The soft murmur of customers, the faint clinking of coffee cups, and the smell of freshly brewed espresso were all distant, irrelevant sounds to her now. The invitation sat heavy in her hands, as though it carried more than just an opportunity. It carried a sense of possibility, one that both thrilled and terrified her. The small cafe that had been her second home for nearly a decade felt different today. The usually comforting warmth of the worn wooden tables, the familiar faces of the regulars, and the steady hum of activity now seemed to fade into the background, as if the universe had shifted focus solely onto her. Olivia, who had always prided herself on her practicality and calmness, now found herself facing an emotional storm that matched the downpour outside. Why had David Wellington invited her? That question was a constant echo in her mind, growing louder with each passing moment. She tried to reason it out, to find some logical explanation, but none came. It wasn't as if she had ever shared more than a few polite words with him. He had always been kind, sure, but there was no real relationship there. At least not one that would justify something so grand, so out of the ordinary. Her thoughts inevitably turned to Ethan, her son, the one constant in her life that anchored her through all the uncertainties. He was only 11, but already too aware of the world's limitations, too aware of their humble circumstances. She worked hard to shield him from disappointment, from the harshness of the realities she herself had grown accustomed to. It wasn't an easy life, but it was honest. Olivia had never wanted Ethan to feel the sting of envy for things beyond their reach. They had their routines, their moments of joy, and that was enough, or so she told herself. But now, here was this invitation, this door to another world, a world where money wasn't an issue, where opportunity lay not just around the corner, but at your feet. Olivia could feel the weight of that world pressing on her, both alluring and suffocating at once. What would Ethan think? Would he be excited? Nervous? Or would he, like her, feel out of place in such extravagance? She couldn't imagine bringing him to such an event where everyone would be dressed in the finest clothes, speaking in the elegant, polished way of the rich and influential. How could they, who live paycheck to paycheck, ever hope to blend in? Olivia closed her eyes for a moment, trying to silence the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her mind. She took a deep breath, setting the envelope down on the counter beside her and returning to her duties. The cafe wasn't going to run itself, and she had a job to do. But as she moved between tables, refilling coffee cups and clearing away plates, her mind kept drifting back to that envelope, to David's piercing blue eyes as he handed it to her. The rest of the day passed in a blur. By the time her shift ended, the rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, the city streets slick and shimmering under the fading evening light. Olivia collected her things, wrapping her worn scarf around her neck and tucking the envelope into her bag, as if hiding it from sight would somehow make the decision easier. She stepped out into the cool air, her feet carrying her through the familiar path home, her thoughts still tangled in the possibilities that awaited her. As she approached the small apartment building where she and Ethan lived, she felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. How was she going to explain this to him? Should she even mention it? What if she accepted the invitation and it turned out to be a disaster? What if Ethan got his hopes up, only to feel the sting of rejection from a world that wasn't theirs to claim? Pushing the door open to their apartment, Olivia was greeted by the familiar sight of Ethan sprawled out on the couch, his homework spread across the coffee table, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she entered, a smile breaking across his face. "Hey, Mom, how was work?" Ethan asked, his eyes bright with the simple joy of seeing her. "Same as usual," she replied, smiling back, though the weight of the invitation in her bag felt heavier now than it had all day. Ethan glanced at her, his curiosity piqued. "You look like something's on your mind. Everything okay?" Olivia hesitated. She hadn't planned on telling him about the invitation just yet. She wasn't even sure she wanted to. But Ethan had always been perceptive, and she knew he could sense when something was off. "There's something I need to talk to you about," she said, setting her bag down and sitting beside him on the couch. She pulled out the envelope, holding it up for him to see that Ethan's eyes widened. "What's that?" "It's an invitation," Olivia began, unsure of how to explain it in a way that didn't sound completely ridiculous. "You know Mr. Wellington? The man who comes to the cafe a lot?" Ethan nodded. He had heard her mention David Wellington a few times before, usually in passing, but he didn't know much about him beyond the fact that he was one of her regular customers. "Well, today he invited us to his birthday party," Olivia continued, watching Ethan's face closely for his reaction. His mouth dropped open in shock. "Wait, what? His birthday party? Like a rich guy's birthday party?" Olivia couldn't help but chuckle at his incredulity. "Yes, exactly like that. I'm not sure why he invited us, but he did." Ethan's face lit up with excitement. "That's awesome. Are we going to go?" That was the question, wasn't it? Olivia felt her stomach churn with uncertainty. She wanted to say yes, to let her son experience something special, something far beyond the confines of their usual life. But at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't belong there, that it was a world too far removed from their reality. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, running a hand through her hair. "I mean, it's a really fancy event. I'm not sure we'd fit in." Ethan frowned, his enthusiasm faltering. "Why not? I mean, it's not like we're doing anything wrong by going. And if he invited us, he must want us there, right?" Olivia sighed, leaning back against the couch. Ethan's logic was sound, but it didn't ease the unease gnawing at her. "I guess I just worry that it might be awkward, you know, being around all those rich, fancy people." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his brows furrowed in thought. "But maybe it won't be. Maybe it'll be fun. And besides, how many chances do we get to go to a millionaire's party?" Olivia smiled softly, admiring his optimism. Ethan had always been good at finding the silver lining, even in the most uncertain of situations. She wanted to protect him from disappointment, from the potential of feeling out of place. But maybe, just maybe, he was right. Maybe this was an opportunity for both of them to step outside of their comfort zone, to experience something new. "I'll think about it," she said finally, though even as she said the words, she knew her decision was already leaning toward yes. Ethan grinned, clearly pleased with her answer. "Cool. I mean, how bad could it be, right?" Olivia laughed. the tension in her chest easing just a little. Yeah, how bad could it be? That night, as she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, Olivia replayed the day's events in her mind. The invitation, David's calm yet insistent offer, and Ethan's excitement all swirled together, forming a strange cocktail of emotions that left her feeling both anxious and curious. She had spent so long avoiding situations like this, situations that would remind her of how different her life was from the lives of people like David Wellington. She had learned to be content with what she had, to find joy in the small things, like the smell of freshly baked bread at the cafe or the sound of Ethan's laughter filling their tiny apartment. But now, this invitation was tugging at something deeper, something she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge in years, a desire for more. Not necessarily more money or status, but more experiences, more chances to see the world beyond the narrow scope of her everyday life. It wasn't that she was unhappy. It was that she had grown so used to her life being a certain way that the idea of something different, something unknown, felt both exhilarating and terrifying that as the hours passed and the city outside her window grew quiet, Olivia made a decision. She wasn't going to let fear hold her back. This was a chance to step into a new world, even if only for one night, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, casting a soft glow over the city, Olivia got out of bed with a newfound sense of resolve. She wasn't sure what the party would bring or how they would fit in, but she knew one thing for certain. They were going. The party and the luxurious atmosphere the days leading up to David Wellington's party seemed to pass in a blur, with Olivia feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement that she hadn't felt in years. Every time she thought about the invitation, a knot of uncertainty tightened in her stomach. She found herself imagining the scene over and over again. Grand halls, gleaming chandeliers, and guests adorned in designer gowns and tuxedos, all of them effortlessly exuding wealth and elegance. And then there was her and Ethan, the outliers, like guests who had stumbled into the wrong party. It was an image she couldn't shake. Nevertheless, the decision had been made. They were going. Olivia spent the next few days agonizing over what to wear. It was clear this event would be far more extravagant than anything she had ever experienced. Her closet, filled with simple, practical clothes that fit her modest lifestyle, offered no answers. She tried on the few formal outfits she owned, but none of them felt right. They were either too plain or too worn from years of use. She knew she needed something that would make her feel confident, something that would allow her to walk into David Wellington's mansion without feeling like she stuck out like a sore thumb, that in the end, she did something she hadn't done in years. She splurged on a new dress. It wasn't anything overly expensive, but it was elegant. A flowing, deep blue gown that hugged her figure just right, with a neckline that felt sophisticated but not too revealing. When she looked at herself in the mirror, for the first time in a long while, she felt beautiful. It wasn't just the dress. It was the idea of stepping into a new world, if only for a night. Ethan, too, needed something appropriate for the occasion. Though he had initially been excited about the party, as the day drew nearer, Olivia noticed a shift in his mood. He seemed quieter, more withdrawn. It wasn't until she found him sitting on his bed, staring at the floor, that he finally opened up. "Mom," he said softly, not looking up. What if I don't belong there?" Olivia's heart ached at the question. She had been feeling the same way for days, but hearing it come from her son's mouth made it all the more painful. She sat down beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You belong wherever you want to be, Ethan," she said gently. "This is just a party. It doesn't matter how rich or fancy the people there are. We were invited, and that means we're supposed to be there." Ethan sighed, his brow furrowed in thought. "But what if they look at us like we're different?" Olivia smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair away from his face. "We are different, and that's okay. But different doesn't mean we don't belong. We're going to go to this party, and we're going to have fun. It's just one night, and no matter what happens, we'll be together." Ethan looked at her, his eyes searching for reassurance, and after a moment he nodded. "Okay, I guess I'll give it a shot." The night of the party arrived quicker than Olivia expected. The evening air was crisp, a hint of autumn slipping into the late summer warmth as they waited for the car that David had promised would pick them up. Olivia's stomach fluttered with nerves, her fingers constantly smoothing the fabric of her dress as she tried to steady her breathing. Ethan stood beside her, dressed in a simple but smart black suit. He looked handsome, more grown-up than she had ever seen him, but there was still a flicker of apprehension in his eyes that a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the twilight. Olivia felt a surge of anxiety as the driver, a man in a sharp uniform, stepped out and opened the door for them. She glanced at Ethan, who gave her a small, hesitant smile, and together they climbed into the back seat. The ride to David's estate was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound as they watched the city streets fade away, replaced by tree-lined roads and sprawling lawns. Olivia had never been to this part of town before. It was a world of gated communities, pristine gardens, and stately mansions set back from the road, hidden behind high hedges and ornate iron gates. The further they drove, the more surreal it felt, as if they were being transported into a fairy tale, one that existed in a realm far beyond their own. When they finally arrived, Olivia felt her breath catch in her throat. David Wellington's estate was even more magnificent than she had imagined. The house, no, the mansion, rose up before them like something out of a movie, its grand facade illuminated by soft golden lights that bathed the stone walls in a warm glow. Towering columns framed the entrance, and wide marble steps led up to massive double doors. The lawn stretched out in every direction, meticulously manicured, with fountains and statues dotting the landscape like pieces of art. As they stepped out of the car, Olivia felt a wave of self-consciousness wash over her. She had known this party would be extravagant, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. She glanced at Ethan, who stood beside her, wide-eyed and silent. He was clearly just as overwhelmed as she was. "Wow," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "This place is huge." Olivia nodded, unable to find the right words. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that they belonged here, at least for tonight. They walked up the marble steps, following the steady stream of elegantly dressed guests who were also arriving. Olivia's heart raced as they approached the grand entrance, where uniformed staff greeted them with smiles and guided them inside. The interior of the mansion was just as breathtaking as the exterior. The foyer was vast, with high ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers that sparkled like stars. Marble floors gleamed beneath their feet, and the walls were lined with artwork that looked like it belonged in a museum. As they stepped further into the house, Olivia could hear the distant sound of music, soft, classical notes drifting through the air, carried by a live string quartet stationed somewhere in the distance. The guests, dressed in designer gowns and tuxedos, moved through the space with an air of effortless sophistication, sipping champagne and engaging in quiet conversation. Olivia felt like she had stepped into a scene from a dream, where everything was too perfect, too polished. Her nerves flared up again. She glanced at Ethan, who was taking it all in with wide eyes, his face a mix of awe and uncertainty. She could tell he felt out of place, just as she did, but there was also a spark of curiosity in his gaze, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. That a server appeared beside them, offering glasses of champagne on a silver tray. Olivia hesitated for a moment before taking one, feeling the cool glass in her hand. She took a sip, hoping the bubbles would help calm her nerves, and was relieved when they did. If only a little. As they made their way further into the mansion, Olivia couldn't help but marvel at the sheer opulence of it all. Every detail, from the ornate chandeliers to the polished mahogany furniture, screamed wealth and luxury. She felt like an outsider looking in, as if she were merely a guest in someone else's world, a world that, despite its beauty, still felt foreign to her. They wandered through the rooms, marveling at the artwork, the sculptures, and the lavish decor. Each room seemed more extravagant than the last, with rich velvet curtains, gilded mirrors, and antique furnishings that looked like they belonged in a palace. The guests moved effortlessly through the space, chatting in small groups, their conversations filled with the easy confidence of people who had lived their entire lives surrounded by such luxury. Olivia and Ethan, by contrast, felt like they were floating through the event in a bubble of quiet observation. They smiled politely when someone glanced their way, but for the most part, they kept to themselves, content to take in the atmosphere rather than engaged. It wasn't until they reached the main ballroom that the full scale of the party became apparent. The ballroom was enormous, with towering ceilings and glittering chandeliers that cast a soft, golden light over the space. The floor was polished to a high shine, reflecting the twinkling lights above, and the walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the sprawling gardens outside. In the center of the room, guests mingled, their laughter and conversation blending with the soft strains of the string quartet playing in the corner. Waitstaff moved gracefully through the crowd, offering trays of delicate hors d'oeuvres and champagne to the guests at the far end of the room. Olivia spotted David Wellington, standing near a grand staircase that curved up to the second floor. He was dressed in a sleek, tailored suit, looking every bit the picture of wealth and elegance. His presence seemed to command attention without effort, and as he spoke with a group of guests, they leaned in, hanging on his every word. For a moment, Olivia considered walking over to thank him for the invitation, but as she looked at the people surrounding him, the men in perfectly cut suits, the women in shimmering gowns, she hesitated. They seemed so at ease, so natural in this environment, and she felt a pang of insecurity. What would she even say? She had no idea how to navigate these kinds of social circles, no idea how to talk about the things that likely interested people like David Wellington and his friends. If sensing her unease, Ethan leaned in closer. "Mom, this place is amazing, but do you think we should really be here?" His voice was low, uncertain, and Olivia felt the same doubt creeping into her own mind. But before she could respond, David Wellington's gaze shifted across the room and landed on them. A broad smile spread across his face, and with a few polite words to the guests around him, he excused himself and made his way toward them. The unexpected bond between the millionaire and the waitress as David Wellington approached them, Olivia felt her pulse quicken. His confident stride, the easy smile on his face, and the air of command he carried made him seem larger than life. He wasn't just a millionaire. He was someone who moved through the world with a sense of certainty, a man used to getting what he wanted and making things happen. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she didn't belong here. But as David came closer, his expression softened, and suddenly, he seemed less like the imposing figure she had imagined and more like an old friend coming to say hello. "Olivia," he said warmly, his voice carrying over the soft hum of conversation around them. "I'm so glad you could make it. And you must be Ethan." Ethan's eyes widened slightly, as though he couldn't believe that this man, this powerful, wealthy man, knew his name. He nodded shyly, his voice quiet as he replied, "Yes, sir. Thank you for inviting us." David's smile deepened as he glanced between them. "It's a pleasure to have you both here. Please enjoy yourselves. There's plenty to see, and the night's just getting started." Olivia managed a small smile, but inside she felt a surge of discomfort. It was hard to relax in a place like this, surrounded by people who lived such different lives. She wasn't sure what to say, how to behave, or even how to stand without feeling awkward. But David seemed to sense her unease, and before she could overthink it, he leaned in slightly, his tone quieter, more personal. "Don't worry," he said with a conspiratorial wink. "It's just a party. The fancy surroundings don't change that. Just be yourselves." His words, simple as they were, had a calming effect on Olivia. She nodded, grateful for the reassurance, and for the first time that evening, she felt a small flicker of confidence. Maybe this night wouldn't be as overwhelming as she had feared. David stayed with them for a few moments longer, engaging Ethan in a light conversation about school, sports, and video games. It amazed Olivia how effortlessly David spoke to her son, making him feel at ease. Ethan, who had been so nervous before, was now laughing, his usual bright energy returning as he chatted with a man who seemed so different from the typical authority figures he was used to. As the conversation wound down, David excused himself to attend to other guests, but not before offering a kind smile and a quiet promise. "We'll talk more later." And with that, he was gone, swallowed by the throng of guests milling about the ballroom. Olivia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She looked at Ethan, who was still smiling, his earlier anxiety apparently forgotten. "He's pretty cool," Ethan said, his tone filled with admiration. Olivia nodded in agreement, though a part of her was still struggling to understand why David Wellington, a man who had everything, had taken such an interest in them. There was no denying that he was charming, and his presence had a way of making people feel special. But what was his real motivation? Why had he invited them to this party in the first place? The evening unfolded with an unexpected ease after their initial encounter with David. Olivia and Ethan wandered through the mansion, sampling the extravagant hors d'oeuvres and marveling at the sheer luxury of everything around them. The music from the string quartet provided a gentle backdrop to the evening, and as they moved from one opulent room to the next, Olivia couldn't help but feel a strange sense of wonder. Despite her initial reservations, she was starting to enjoy herself. Yet, there was always that lingering feeling of being an outsider. She could see it in the way some of the other guests looked at them. Brief glances, subtle smiles, as if they were trying to place her, trying to understand who she was and why she was there. It didn't take long for Olivia to realize that most of the guests probably assumed she was someone important, perhaps a friend of David's or a business associate. After all, why else would they be invited to such an exclusive event? But Olivia knew the truth. She wasn't one of them. She was a waitress who lived paycheck to paycheck, who worried about rent and bills and whether she'd have enough to cover Ethan's growing needs. And David Wellington was a millionaire, a man whose wealth and influence stretched far beyond anything she could comprehend. They were worlds apart. That's why, when David found her later that evening, pulling her aside for a quiet conversation, Olivia wasn't sure how to react. She had been standing near one of the grand windows, looking out at the sprawling gardens below, when she felt his presence beside her. His voice was soft, easy, as if they had known each other for years. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with a quiet amusement. Olivia turned to face him, her expression guarded. "It's overwhelming, but in a good way, I think." David nodded thoughtfully. "It can be a lot to take in. These kinds of parties, they're not really about the celebration. They're more about appearances." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "Appearances?" He shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. "People come to these events to see and be seen. It's all part of the game. Who's wearing what, who's talking to whom, who's making the right connections." Olivia studied him for a moment, trying to understand what lay behind his words. There was something about the way he said it, a subtle undercurrent of weariness, as though the glamour of his world didn't hold the same allure for him anymore. "Is that why you do it?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "For appearances?" David chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not anymore. I used to, though. It's easy to get caught up in it when you're in my position. But these days, I'm more interested in real connections. With real people." Olivia's heart skipped a beat. There was something in his voice, something genuine, that caught her off guard. For a moment, she forgot about the grand surroundings, the wealth, and the status. All she saw was a man standing before her, speaking plainly without pretense. "Why did you invite us?" she asked, the question spilling out before she could stop herself. David was silent for a moment, his eyes searching hers. Then he sighed, his expression softening. "Because I wanted to. I've been coming to that cafe for years, watching you work, watching the way you care for your customers, the way you take care of your son. It's not something you see every day. Someone who works that hard, with that much integrity. I respect that." Olivia blinked, taken aback by his words. She had never imagined that someone like David Wellington could see her that way. She had always assumed she was just another face in the crowd, just another person serving coffee and clearing tables. But here he was, telling her that he had noticed her, that he respected her. "I'm just doing my job," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. David smiled gently. "Maybe, but it's more than that. You're giving people something they need, kindness, compassion, a sense of connection. That's rare, Olivia." Olivia felt a lump form in her throat. She wasn't used to receiving compliments like this, especially not from someone like David. She wasn't sure how to respond, so she looked away, her gaze drifting back to the window. David seemed to sense her discomfort, and he shifted the conversation, his tone becoming lighter. "Besides, I thought Ethan might enjoy the party. He seems like a great kid." Olivia smiled at the mention of her son. "He is. He's everything to me." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I can tell. The way you look at him, It's clear how much you care." There was a brief silence between them, one that was not uncomfortable, but rather filled with the weight of unspoken understanding. Olivia had never expected to have such a conversation with a man like David Wellington, and yet here they were, standing in the middle of his opulent mansion, talking about life, about family, about the things that truly mattered. "I've always wondered," David said after a moment, his voice quiet. "What's your story, Olivia? How did you end up here?" Olivia hesitated. It wasn't a question she was used to answering, especially not in this kind of setting. But there was something about David that made her want to open up, to share a part of herself that she usually kept hidden. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I grew up in a small town. My parents didn't have much, but we got by. I met Ethan's father when I was young. Too young, probably. We had Ethan, but things didn't work out between us. He left before Ethan was even born." David's expression remained calm, but Olivia could see the sympathy in his eyes. "It wasn't easy," she continued. "Raising Ethan on my own, working long hours just to make ends meet. But I did it. I had to." David listened intently, his gaze never leaving hers. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity, just a quiet understanding that seemed to reach deeper than she had expected. "And you've done an incredible job," he said softly. "Ethan's lucky to have you." Olivia felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. She had spent so many years feeling like she was just barely holding it together, like she was always one step away from everything falling apart. To hear someone acknowledge her efforts, to truly see her, meant more than she could put into words. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. David smiled, and for the first time that evening, Olivia felt a genuine sense of connection with him. It wasn't about wealth or status or appearances. It was about two people sharing a moment of understanding, two people who, despite their vastly different lives, had found common ground. They stood there for a while longer, talking about life, about family, and about the things that mattered most. And as the night went on, Olivia realized that David Wellington wasn't just a millionaire with a lavish lifestyle. He was a man who, like her, had his own struggles, his own doubts, and his own desire for something real, something meaningful. In that moment, Olivia felt something shift inside her. The barriers she had built around herself, the wall she had erected to keep herself safe, began to crumble. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she belonged here after all.